Antiseptic masked the underlying stench of copper, but Nadia knew it was there. 7 nurses had walked into the Costa estate before her, and 7 had run out crying. Nadia couldn't afford to run. Monsters paid in cash, and right now, cash was the only thing standing between her and the streets. Gravel crunched beneath her worn shoes as she approached the sprawling, meticulously manicured estate. It was a jarring contrast to the rough men guarding its perimeter thugs in dark windbreakers smelling of stale tobacco and damp wool. Nadia kept her eyes locked on the massive mahogany doors, ignoring the sharp bite of her medical bag's canvas strap digging into her shoulder. She had packed it heavy with broad-spectrum antibiotics, heavy-duty gauze, and a sterile suturing kit that had drained her final grocery budget. She belonged in a sterile clinic, not a mafia stronghold. But her hours had been slashed, resulting in a violently pink eviction notice taped to her apartment door. Worse, the dampness of that cheap apartment was settling into her younger brother's lungs. Leo's rattling cough demanded a new place, and she needed the deposit yesterday. Abbott, the house manager, met her in the cavernous marble foyer. He possessed the rigid posture of a military man and flat, gray eyes that instantly cataloged her frayed cuffs and the nervous tremor in her hands. "He is difficult," Abbott's low rumble echoed off the marble walls. The others tried to coddle him. "Do not coddle him, but do not disrespect him either." He threw a crystal ashtray at the last girl's head because she asked him to say please. Nadia swallowed hard, hating how small her voice sounded in the opulent space. "Does he pay up front?" Without a word, Abbott produced a thick manila envelope from his tailored jacket and extended it. Nadia took it, her dry, overwashed fingers rough against the heavy paper. "Half now," Abbott stated flatly. "Half if you last the week." Before she could process the weight of the money, a violent crash shattered the quiet from the floor above. Something incredibly heavy slammed against solid wood, followed instantly by a string of guttural Italian curses. Nadia flinched. The urge to drop the envelope and flee back to her rusted sedan clawed at her throat, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. But then she pictured Leo's nearly empty inhaler sitting on their cramped kitchen counter. She tightened her grip, folded the envelope, and shoved it deep into her medical bag. "Lead the way," she murmured. They climbed the sweeping staircase, the impossibly thick carpet swallowing their footsteps as they ascended toward the uneasy silence waiting behind the double doors. The smell hit her first, a sickeningly sweet odor of necrotic tissue masking beneath the sharp, metallic tang of old injury and the aggressive, peppery scent of expensive sandalwood cologne. The room was shrouded in shadow, heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the late afternoon sun. On the massive 4-poster bed lay Dante Costa. He didn't look like an untouchable kingpin. He looked like a dying animal in a gilded cage. His chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths. Dark hair clung to his forehead, plastered down by a sheen of feverish sweat. His left shoulder was a mangled mess of torn flesh and hastily wrapped, dark-soaked bandages. A shattered crystal decanter lay in a pool of amber liquid near the foot of the bed. Dante's eyes tracked her as she stepped into the room. They were a striking, unnatural shade of pale amber, currently clouded with severe pain and high fever, but predatory all the same. He looked at her not as a person, but as an intrusion, an annoyance. "Get out," he rasped. His voice was like sandpaper on dry wood. Nadia didn't move. She stood near the door, her cheap sneakers almost touching the spilled liquor. She looked at the mess, then at him. She was terrified. Yes, her knees felt weak. But beneath the terror was a creeping, unfamiliar spark of profound, exhausted irritation. She had been on her feet for 14 hours before taking this call. She simply did not have the energy for theatrics. She walked past the broken glass, deliberately ignoring it. She set her bag on the ornate nightstand, the heavy canvas hitting the polished mahogany with a dull, dismissive thud. "Abbott," she said without turning around. "Bring me a bucket of hot water, clean towels, and a trash can. Now." She heard the slight shift of fabric behind her as Abbott hesitated, unaccustomed to taking orders in this house, followed by the quiet click of the door closing. She was alone with him. Nadia reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out a pair of latex gloves. The sharp snap as they pulled tight over her wrist sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Dante's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his pale skin. "Are you deaf? I told you to leave. I don't need a nurse." "You need a mortician if you don't let me clean that," Nadia said evenly. She unlatched her bag, the metal zipper rasping loudly. "I don't care who you are. I don't care how many ashtrays you throw. I am getting paid to keep you breathing. If you hit me, I will walk out, and you will die of sepsis in your very expensive bed." She didn't wait for his response. She picked up a pair of heavy, blunt-nosed trauma shears. "I have to cut the shirt." Dante stared at her. The violent fury in his eyes fought a losing battle against the sheer, blinding agony radiating from his shoulder. His breathing hitched, ribs expanding painfully. Slowly, deliberately, he gave a sharp, imperceptible nod. The fabric of his custom silk shirt gave way with a sickening, tearing sound. As Nadia peeled the ruined material back, the true extent of the damage was revealed. The bullet had passed cleanly through the muscle, but whatever had happened afterward was a disaster. The edges of the wound were inflamed, angry red, and weeping a thick yellow fluid. The smell intensified, a punch to the gut that made Nadia's stomach roll. She breathed strictly through her mouth, forcing her hands to remain perfectly steady. She grabbed a sterile alcohol wipe. "This is going to burn." "Just do it," he hissed through clenched teeth. She applied the antiseptic. Dante's entire body went rigid. A low, animalistic groan vibrated deep in his throat, but he didn't pull away. Nadia worked mechanically. Wipe, discard, apply pressure, assess. She could feel the intense heat radiating from his skin, burning straight through the thin latex of her gloves. He was running a dangerous system-wide fever. "Who stitched this?" she asked, her voice tight as she examined the jagged, amateurish black thread closing the deepest part of the laceration. "One of my men," Dante grunted, his eyes squeezed shut, sweat pooling in the hollow of his throat. "He did a terrible job. It's trapping the infection." Nadia picked up a surgical scalpel. "I have to open it, flush it, and redo it. It will hurt considerably more than the bullet did." Dante opened his eyes. They locked onto hers. The hazy, feverish amber was razor-sharp for a fraction of a second. He was searching her face for hesitation, for the familiar tremor of fear that usually preceded someone begging for their life in his presence. Nadia stared back, unflinching. Her eyes were dull, rimmed with red from sheer lack of sleep. She wasn't looking at a mafia boss. She was looking at a leaking pipe that needed fixing before it ruined her paycheck. "Do it," he commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The next hour was a brutal exercise in endurance for both of them. Nadia numbed the area locally with lidocaine, but the severe inflammation meant the anesthetic was only partially effective. She cut, she drained, she flushed with saline until the metal tray beside the bed was filled with pink-tinged water and ruined gauze. Dante didn't speak. He gripped the heavy carved wooden bedpost with his right hand until his knuckles turned bone white. The only sounds in the room were the soft, clinical clinking of metal instruments, his ragged, desperate breathing, and the distant, muffled thud of a storm front starting to batter the window panes. When she finally pulled the last pristine suture tight and taped down a clean, thick surgical dressing, Nadia stepped back. Her lower back ached violently, a dull throb at the base of her spine. She stripped off the bloody gloves and dropped them into the trash can Abbott had silently left by the door. Dante was completely still, his chest rising and falling in an exhausted, shallow rhythm. His eyes were closed, his face ashen. Nadia went to the adjoining bathroom and washed her hands. The soap was absurdly luxurious, smelling strongly of bergamot and cedar, but the water was blissfully hot. She scrubbed her skin until it was raw and pink. When she returned to the bedroom, she dragged a heavy leather armchair closer to the side of the bed. She checked his IV line, a bag of hydrating fluids, and strong, broad-spectrum antibiotics she had hung from a brass coat rack, and sat down. Night dragged its heels. The sprawling house descended into an oppressive, heavy silence. Nadia tried to read a dog-eared paperback she'd brought, but the words blurred into meaningless black lines. The adrenaline from the procedure was fading rapidly, leaving behind a cold, shaky exhaustion. She rested her head against the wing of the leather chair, pulling her thin sweater tighter around her shoulders. Around 3 a.m., the thrashing began. The fever spiked again, hard and fast. Dante muttered violently, his voice thick and frantic, twisting on the mattress. His sudden jerky movements threatened to rip out the IV line taped to the back of his hand. Nadia stood up quickly, leaning over him to pin his uninjured right arm down to the mattress. "Dante, stop. You're going to tear the stitches." He didn't hear her. He was trapped somewhere else, lost in some violent memory playing out behind his eyelids. His arm swept out blindly, and his large hand clamped around her wrist. The grip was devastating, bone ground painfully against bone. Panic shot up Nadia's arm, sharp and immediate. It wasn't the romanticized grip of a brooding hero. It was the desperate, crushing hold of a man who killed for a living. Her heart leaped into her throat. She tugged backward, but it was like pulling against a locked vice. "Let go," she gasped, genuine fear finally bleeding into her voice. He yanked her closer, his eyes flying open but seeing right through her. "Non ti azardar," he spat, his breath hot and smelling of sickness against her face. Nadia's breathing hitched. She was trapped. She wasn't a fighter. She had never thrown a punch in her life, but she spent her days fixing broken human machinery. She knew exactly how the body worked. Instead of pulling away and tearing her own ligaments, she leaned forward. She jammed her left thumb brutally into the webbed nerve center between his thumb and forefinger, dropping her entire body weight behind the pressure. Dante let out a sharp gasp, a sudden intake of air, and his hand spasmed open instinctively. Nadia stumbled back, clutching her freed wrist against her chest. It throbbed fiercely, already turning an angry mottled red. She glared at the man on the bed, her chest heaving. He had slumped back onto the sweat-soaked pillows, unconscious once more, breathing heavily. "Jerk," she whispered venomously to the empty room. She marched to the bathroom, grabbed a washcloth, soaked it in freezing water, and aggressively slapped it onto his burning forehead. Then she retreated to her chair, pulling her knees up to her chest, and didn't close her eyes for the rest of the night, watching the rise and fall of his chest with suspicious, hawkish eyes. Dawn arrived weak and gray. Dust motes danced lazily in the thin slivers of light escaping the velvet curtains. Nadia was chewing loudly on a stale piece of dry toast she'd found at the bottom of her bag, staring blankly at the far wall. A dry rustle of Egyptian cotton sheets drew her attention. Dante's eyes were open. The cloudy, unfocused glaze of the fever was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. He looked up at the ceiling, orienting himself, then slowly turned his head to look at her. Nadia swallowed her bite of toast. It felt like dry sawdust scraping down her throat. She didn't say anything, merely raised an eyebrow. Dante looked down at her hands. Her left wrist sported a distinct, dark bruising pattern in the undeniable shape of large fingers. He frowned, a slight, dangerous furrow appearing between his brows. "You're still here," he said. His voice was deeper now, stripped of the agonizing rasp, resonating with a quiet authority that commanded the room. Nadia wiped toast crumbs off her scrub pants. "Unfortunately, your fever broke around 5. You didn't rip your stitches." She stood up, her stiff joints popping loudly in the quiet room. She walked to the nightstand, checking the empty IV bag. "And you owe me another $500 for the wrist." Dante stared at her in complete silence. He was waiting for the punchline. He was waiting for the nervous giggle, for the frantic apology, for her to realize who she was demanding money from. None came. Nadia just unhooked the empty fluid bag and marked a chart on the nightstand with a cheap ballpoint pen. "I could have you killed for speaking to me like that," he stated casually, his tone conversational. Nadia paused, the cheap pen hovering midair. She looked down at him. There was no defiance in her gaze, no manufactured bravery, just a profound, bone-deep weariness of a woman who had bigger problems waiting for her at home. "You could," she agreed quietly, clicking the pen shut. "But then you'd have to find an 8th nurse. And frankly, Mr. Costa, I think your reputation is out of clean bandages." Tuesday brought relentless, driving rain. It battered the reinforced glass of the master bedroom windows in a steady, maddening rhythm. Inside, the heavy velvet curtains remained drawn. The room smelled of iodine, rubbing alcohol, and the sharp, acidic tang of the black espresso Abbott brought up every 4 hours. By day 4, the immediate threat of sepsis had passed, but a new, infinitely more exhausting battle had begun. Dante Costa was healing, which meant he was awake, alert, and bored. Nadia sat on the edge of the leather armchair, a lukewarm cup of tap water resting against her knee. Her scrubs were stiff, the cheap cotton chafing the sensitive skin at the back of her neck. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a time. Her muscles ached with a dull, persistent throbbing. "Take the pill," Nadia said. She didn't raise her voice. She barely had the energy to move her jaw. Dante sat propped against a mountain of dark pillows, an encrypted laptop resting on his uninjured thighs. He didn't look up from the screen. "I don't need it. The pain is manageable." "You ground your teeth so hard last night I thought you were going to crack a molar," Nadia replied, staring at the small, white oval sitting in the center of her calloused palm. "Take the muscle relaxer, or I'm going to crush it up and put it in your espresso." Dante finally shifted his gaze. His amber eyes were clear now, stripping away the vulnerability the fever had forced upon him. He looked at her with a heavy, flat appraisal. He noted the dark, bruised-looking bags under her eyes, the way her hair was haphazardly tied back with a frayed elastic, and the absolute lack of deference in her posture. He closed the laptop with a sharp, definitive click. "You forget where you are, Nadia. I am in a bedroom that costs more than my life, arguing with a grown man about a pill," she said flatly. She stood up, her worn sneakers scuffing against the plush rug. She walked to the edge of the mattress and held out her hand. "Swallow it. Then you can go back to ordering hits, or whatever it is you do on that computer." A muscle ticked in his jaw. It was a dangerous, volatile micro-expression. The men downstairs would have stepped back. Nadia didn't. She was simply too tired to care. The eviction notice was still a heavy weight in the bottom of her medical bag, right next to her brother's empty inhaler. Fear required energy. She was running on fumes. Dante reached out and plucked the pill from her hand. His fingertips brushed her palm, warm, rough, calloused. He swallowed it dry, never breaking eye contact. "Satisfied?" he murmured. "Ecstatic," she muttered, turning back to her chair. The uneasy truce held for another 24 hours, snapping violently on Thursday afternoon. Abbott opened the double doors, ushering in 2 men wearing heavy, wet wool coats. They smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and damp concrete. One of them carried a thick, leather-bound ledger. The tension in the room spiked immediately. The air grew dense, suffocating. Nadia was in the middle of changing Dante's bandages. She had his left arm immobilized, carefully peeling back the sterile tape. "Boss," the taller man said, his voice a gravelly bark. He completely ignored Nadia, stepping up to the foot of the bed. "The shipment's at the docks. The Russians are demanding a renegotiation. We need a sign-off." Dante stiffened. The muscles in his chest tightened, pulling violently against the newly healing skin. A sharp hiss escaped his teeth as the wound stretched. "Stop moving," Nadia snapped, pressing a gloved hand firmly against his collarbone to keep him pinned to the mattress. "Get off me," Dante growled, trying to push her hand away with his good arm. He glared at the men at the foot of his bed. "Tell them to wait. If they touch a single crate, break their fingers." "They're not waiting," the second man argued, stepping closer. Nadia felt the heat radiating from Dante's skin. His pulse was jumping frantically against her wrist. He was going to tear the stitches. She could feel the fragile skin giving way beneath the gauze. She dropped the roll of medical tape. It bounced off the mattress and rolled onto the floor. "Out," Nadia said. The room went dead silent. The 2 men at the foot of the bed finally looked at her. Their expressions shifted from confusion to cold, hard amusement. "Excuse me, sweetheart?" the taller man sneered, reaching casually inside his wet coat. The dull clink of a heavy buckle or a holster echoed in the quiet room. Nadia didn't look at the coat. She looked at Dante. His blood pressure is skyrocketing. The internal sutures are bearing the brunt of his movement. If he tears the muscle wall, he will hemorrhage, and you will be dragging him down those stairs in a body bag. "Get them out of my patient's room." Dante stared at her. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline flooding her exhausted system. Her knuckles were white, where she gripped the bed rail. She was a tiny, frayed thing in faded scrubs, physically standing between a mafia boss and his enforcers. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched. The sound of the rain hitting the glass seemed deafening. Dante let out a slow, measured breath. He leaned his head back against the pillows. "You heard the nurse, Carlo," Dante said softly. His voice was quiet, but it carried a razor edge that made the hair on the back of Nadia's neck stand up. "Wait downstairs." Carlo blinked, his hand freezing inside his coat. "But the docs." "I said, wait downstairs," Dante repeated, the volume dropping even lower. The two men exchanged a look, swallowed hard, and backed out of the room, closing the heavy doors behind them with a soft, definitive click. Nadia exhaled, a long, shaky breath that rattled in her chest. She slumped against the edge of the bed, dragging a hand down her face. She smelled the latex on her gloves, the metallic tang of the blood spotting the old gauze. "You are reckless," Dante stated into the quiet. Nadia picked up the fresh roll of tape. "I'm a professional. Carlo would have shot you if I hadn't spoken. Then Abbott would owe me hazard pay," Nadia replied, pulling the tape tight across his chest. She didn't look at his face. If she looked, she might actually realize what she had just done, and the panic she was holding at bay would finally break through. Sunday morning leaked into the room pale and indifferent. The heavy storm had finally broken, leaving behind a cold, damp chill that seeped through the thick stone walls of the estate. It was day 7. Nadia stood in the master bathroom, staring at her reflection in the gilded mirror. Her skin was sallow, completely devoid of color. The dark circles under her eyes looked like permanent bruises. She turned on the gold-plated faucet, splashed freezing water onto her face, and dried it with a towel that felt thicker than the mattress in her apartment. She walked back into the bedroom. Dante was not in bed. He was standing by the massive window, looking out over the manicured grounds. He wore a pair of dark slacks and a fresh, crisp linen shirt, left unbuttoned halfway down his chest to accommodate the bulky dressing on his shoulder. Without the fever, without the vulnerability of the mattress, the sheer physical size of the man was overwhelming. His shoulders blocked out the weak morning sun. He turned as she approached. "It's time to take the stitches out," Nadia said. Her voice sounded hollow in the vast room. She set a small, sterile metal tray on the table near the window. A pair of fine-tipped scissors and stainless steel tweezers rattled against the metal. Dante walked over and sat on the edge of a velvet chaise lounge. He didn't say a word. He simply undid the remaining buttons of his shirt and pulled the fabric back, exposing the angry, red scar tissue slicing across his shoulder. Nadia pulled on her gloves. The familiar snap echoed. She stepped close to him. She could smell his skin, no longer the sour scent of sickness and sweat, but clean soap and the sharp, peppery cologne he favored. "Hold still," she murmured. She slid the bottom blade of the scissors under the first tight knot of black thread. Snip. She grabbed the end with the tweezers and pulled smoothly. Dante didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, a statue of muscle and quiet danger. Snip, pull. Snip, pull. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the unsaid. They were two people operating entirely on survival instincts, just in vastly different tax brackets. "Abbott has your money," Dante said suddenly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against Nadia's knuckles where she rested her hand on his collarbone for leverage. "Good. Snip. Pull. I expect the full amount. I could pay you double to stay," he offered. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. A man used to buying whatever convenience he required. "You are efficient. My men are careless. It would be a permanent retainer." Nadia paused. The tweezers hovered over the last stitch. Double the money. It meant a safe neighborhood. It meant Leo seeing a specialist. It meant never looking at a violently pink eviction notice again. She looked down at the jagged line of healing flesh. It was an ugly wound, inflicted by a violent world. If she stayed, there would be more wounds. Bullet holes, knife lacerations, shattered bones. She would be stitching up monsters so they could go back out and make more monsters. She slid the scissors under the final knot. Snip, pull. She dropped the bloody thread onto the metal tray, stripped off her gloves, and tossed them into the trash. "No," she said. Dante's eyes narrowed. He looked up at her, the amber flashing with genuine unmasked surprise. Are you bargaining? I don't bargain, Nadia said, turning away to pack her canvas bag. She tossed the heavy rolls of gauze and the bottles of saline inside, zipping it shut with a harsh, abrasive sound. Your world is messy, Mr. Costa. I spend my days cleaning up messes. I don't want to live inside one. She hoisted the heavy strap onto her shoulder. The canvas bit into her collarbone, a familiar, grounding pain. Dante stood up. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Nadia forced herself to stand her ground as his shadow fell over her. He reached out, his large, uninjured right hand wrapping around her left wrist. Her breath hitched. She instinctively braced for the crushing pressure from night 2. But the grip was loose, careful. He looked down at the faded, yellowish-green bruises still marking her pale skin, the bruises he had left there in his fever delirium. His thumb brushed lightly over the discoloration. People do not usually walk away from me, Nadia, he said quietly. Nadia looked up at him. She saw the calculating ruthlessness in his eyes, but she also saw the faint, lingering exhaustion of a man who couldn't trust a single soul in his sprawling, empty house. She gently, but firmly, pulled her wrist from his grasp. Take your antibiotics for 2 more days, Nadia instructed, her voice completely devoid of emotion. Keep the area clean. Don't lift anything heavier than your laptop. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. She didn't look back. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Abbott was waiting. He held out the thick manila envelope. It was heavier than the first one. Nadia took it, shoving it deep into the pocket of her scrubs. She walked down the sweeping, curved staircase, her cheap rubber soles silent on the thick carpet. She pushed open the massive mahogany front doors and stepped out into the damp, freezing morning air. The gravel crunched beneath her feet. The dark sedans were still parked in the driveway. The guards and windbreakers still shifted their weight in the cold. Nothing in this brutal, violent world had changed. But as Nadia slid into the driver's seat of her rusted sedan and turned the key, feeling the engine sputter and roar to life, she touched the thick envelope in her pocket. She put the car in drive and drove through the iron gates, leaving the monsters behind in their gilded cage. Did Nadia make the right choice walking away from the Costa Empire, or is her return inevitable? Let us know your theories in the comments below. If you loved this gritty, slow-burn mafia drama, hit that like button and subscribe for more original, grounded stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with friends who crave dark tension without the fairy tale fluff. See you in the next chapter.